My name is Michael, and I've been a fisherman for as long as I can remember. I was born and raised in Ocean View, a small, quiet coastal town in the southern United States where time seems to stand still and the rhythm of our daily lives is marked by the ebb and flow of the tides. Here, everyone knows each other, and life is simple but rewarding. We go out to sea, fish, sell what we catch, and return home at the end of the day to share the ocean's bounty. Ocean View isn't a place of big events or sudden changes. The tides rise and fall. Fishermen head out before the sun appears on the horizon, and the nights are filled with the soft sea breeze and the distant cries of birds resting on the water. The days were repetitive, but in that consistency, there was a comforting peace. The certainty that there would always be fish in the deep. At least, that's how it was until a few weeks ago. I'm going to tell you what happened, though I know some of you won't believe me. That's the nature of people. They always prefer simple explanations, the ones that allow them to move on without questioning what lies beneath the surface. But I'm telling you that what I'm about to share happened exactly as I experienced it, and it changed me forever. It was a dawn like any other, or so I thought when I woke up that day. As usual, I got up before the sun began to light the sky. The town was wrapped in that unique silence of early morning, that moment when the world seems to have stopped, and only the sea, with its constant murmur, keeps moving. The air was fresh, with that unmistakable scent of salt and sea breeze that had always given me a sense of belonging, of being in the right place. I headed to the beach, where my old boat, which I affectionately called Little One, was waiting for me. It was a small but reliable vessel that had weathered storms and tides without ever failing me. I boarded the boat, checked my nets, and began rowing toward the horizon, seeking those spots that only seasoned fishermen know, those places where the fish seem to gather in greater numbers. That morning, everything seemed calm. The water was a mirror reflecting the stars and the first ray of light in the sky. The sea was so still that I could almost hear the echo of my own thoughts. As I cast the nets, I took a deep breath, feeling at peace. For a few minutes, I forgot all my worries. I was alone, surrounded by the vast ocean, in the one place where I had always found solace. But that calm was abruptly shattered. I was hauling in the first net when I heard it. A strange sound, a wail unlike anything I had ever heard in my years as a fisherman. At first I ignored it. I thought it was just the wind playing with the waves or perhaps some distant boat creaking against the currents. But the sound persisted, growing louder, more unsettling. It was a deep moan, long, and there was something in it that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the kind of noise you expect to hear in the middle of the sea, not even on the loneliest mornings. It sounded human. But how was that possible? There was no one nearby, not for miles around. I tried to focus on fishing, ignoring the cold sweat that started to trickle down my back, despite the fresh air. But I couldn't help but look toward the depths, hoping to see something, some explanation for that disturbing sound. Minutes passed and the moaning grew more insistent, as if something or someone was calling to me from the bottom of the ocean. Finally, when I was about to pull in the second net, something happened that changed everything. I felt a tug, a strong one, much more than any fish could cause. At first, I thought I had struck it lucky, that I'd caught one of those enormous fish that you only see once in a lifetime. But as I pulled, something didn't feel right. The weight was uneven, and whatever I had caught in the net seemed to resist in a strange way, not like a fish struggling to break free, but like something else. When I finally managed to lift the net, my heart stopped for a moment. It wasn't a fish that I had in front of me, not even a creature I could recognize. What I saw defied everything I thought I knew about the sea. It was a massive thing, covered in shiny scales that reflected the dim light of dawn. Its skin, slimy and dark, seemed to move on its own, as if it were alive in a way I couldn't understand. But the worst part was its eyes. They were large, dark, and although lifeless, they seemed to be looking directly at me, as if that thing was aware of my presence, as if it could see beyond my exterior and understand what I was thinking at that moment. Those eyes pierced my soul. Without thinking twice, I threw the net back into the sea. My hands shook as I rowed with all my strength toward the shore, wanting to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. My heart was pounding so fast that it felt like it would burst from my chest. I didn't look back, not once. When I finally reached the shore, I felt as though I had been fleeing for hours, though probably only minutes had passed. I was drenched in sweat. The air no longer felt fresh, and my hands were still trembling uncontrollably. I didn't know if it was exhaustion or fear that had left me breathless, but all I wanted was to leave behind what I had seen. I reached the coast much earlier than usual. Normally, I stayed at sea until the sun was high in the sky, but that day was different. I felt as though I had left part of myself floating out there, alongside that creature I still couldn't comprehend. As I walked toward the shore, my body shook, not from cold, but from pure fear. A fear I had never felt before, a fear without a name, but one I now knew all too well. As my feet touched the firm sand, my mind kept trying to make sense of what I had seen. What was that creature? How was it possible for something so strange to be so close to our peaceful town? Whatever it wasn't something I could ignore. I knew I had to tell someone, though I doubted they would believe me. I walked to the fish market, where other fishermen had already begun setting up their stalls. The air was filled with the smell of the sea and fresh fish, and the bustling voices haggling over prices were a familiar sound that, under other circumstances, would have comforted me. But that morning, everything seemed distant, as if I were in a dream I couldn't wake from. I saw several familiar faces, John, Paul, and other fishermen with whom I had shared countless early mornings at sea. They greeted me with a nod, but as soon as they saw me approaching, they noticed something in my expression. It was impossible to hide the terror on my face. "Michael," Paul shouted while carrying a box full of fish. "What happened to you, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." I approached them, still shaking, sweat running down my forehead. I took a breath, and with a trembling voice, I said, "There's something out there in the sea, something that shouldn't be there." My heart raced as I waited for their reactions. Paul and the others looked at each other, and then, as if what I had just said was the most absurd thing they had ever heard, they started laughing. Not nervous laughter, but deep, booming laughs that echoed through the market. "A sea monster," John mocked, slapping me on the back so hard I nearly lost my balance. "What did you drink last night, Michael? Maybe you had a bit more whiskey than usual, huh?" I tried to explain. I told them every detail, the moan I heard, the strange creature, the eyes that seemed to look through me. But the more I spoke, the harder they laughed. To them, it was nothing more than a ridiculous story, a fantasy fueled by exhaustion, or, worse, irrational fear. "Enough!" I finally exclaimed, feeling frustration burn in my chest. "What I saw was not a fantasy. There's something out there and it's wrong. You don't understand, but you should be worried." My shout echoed through the market, and the laughter subsided a little. But still, no one took me seriously. To them, what I had experienced was simply the product of a tired mind. Paul looked at me with a wry smile and said, "Look, Michael, whatever you saw was probably just a big fish, something unusual for this part of the ocean. The sea's full of strange creatures, but sea monsters, that's another story." I felt humiliated, frustrated. I knew what I had seen, but I couldn't force anyone to believe me. I realized I was alone in this. No one else had seen what I saw. No one else had felt that terror when looking into the eyes of that creature. "Fine," I finally said, with a heavy sigh. "Do what you want, but I'm warning you. Don't go near that part of the sea. There's something there that doesn't belong to this world." The day passed slowly after I returned home. I felt restless, as if the walls of my small house were closing in on me. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen that morning, about those dark eyes that still stared at me even when I closed mine. I wrestled between the need to warn others and the growing fear of returning to the sea. Hours passed, and the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the town. From my window, I watched the sky change color, painting everything with a deceptive calm. The sea was calm again, as if nothing had happened, as if what I had seen was nothing more than a nightmare. But I knew it wasn't. As night fell, I made a decision. I couldn't let fear control me. I had to return to the sea. I had to face that thing once more. Part of me wanted to prove that what I had seen wasn't an illusion, while another part, simply wanted to understand what was happening. I grabbed my lantern, checked the nets, and headed to the little one once again. I felt a mixture of fear and determination as I dragged the boat into the water. The words of my fellow fishermen echoed in my mind, their laughter, their mockery. But it no longer mattered. I needed answers. I rowed toward the horizon, where the sun had already disappeared, leaving only a faint line of light in the sky. The stars began to appear, but the sea remained in deep, enveloping darkness. As I ventured further into the waters, the town faded behind me, along with any sense of safety. I reached the same spot where I had seen the creature that morning. I dropped anchor and sat in silence, listening to the gentle movement of the water against the boat. The tension in the air was palpable. Everything was too calm. There were no strong waves, no usual cries of seabirds, not even the wind that normally caressed my face. Just silence, a heavy silence that seemed to swallow any other sound. Suddenly, I heard it again, the moan. This time, it wasn't a distant whisper like before. It was loud, clear, and it came from everywhere, as if the very ocean were crying out in agony. My heart began to race uncontrollably, and for a moment, I thought about rowing back to shore, but something kept me from moving. The same terror that paralyzed me also held me there, waiting. And then, I saw it. The creature emerged from the water smoothly, almost as if the ocean were pushing it toward me. Its scales glowed with a greenish hue under the light of the moon, which had now risen in the sky. But the worst part was its eyes. Those empty eyes fixed on mine, full of an indescribable sadness, as if it were trapped in eternal torment. It was larger than I remembered, much larger. Its body stretched beneath the surface of the water, and I could barely imagine how deep it really was. But what disturbed me the most was that this time, it didn't seem aggressive. It made no move toward me, didn't try to attack or capsize the boat. It just stayed there, looking at me, as if it were waiting for something from me. My breathing was erratic. I was frozen with fear, but I also felt a strange pull toward the creature. There was something about it that made me want to understand it, something that told me it wasn't just a beast. It was as if it were suffering, as if the moan I had heard wasn't a threat, but a cry for help. Suddenly, the creature raised one of its limbs, something that could be described as a hand, though it wasn't human. In its claw, it held a torn net. My heart stopped when I recognized that net. It belonged to one of the fishermen who had disappeared days earlier. The ropes were shredded, as if they had been destroyed by a tremendous force. I tried to scream, but no sound came from my throat. I was paralyzed, unable to take my eyes off what was in front of me. The creature dropped the net into the water, and before I could process what was happening, it disappeared beneath the waves, as silently as it had appeared. The sea returned to its calm state. I rowed back to shore under the cover of night, my heart still pounding in my chest. The fresh morning air wasn't enough to calm the fire in my mind. I rowed relentlessly, wanting to put as much distance as possible between me and the place where I had seen the creature, that monstrous thing that had shown me something I couldn't ignore, the shattered net. I knew it belonged to one of the missing fishermen, and now I understood that those disappearances weren't mere accidents or the ocean's whims. When my feet touched the sand, I felt relieved to be back on solid ground, but that relief was short-lived. The image of the creature and the broken net haunted me. Its empty eyes were etched in my memory. Something wasn't right in the sea, something far darker and more dangerous than any of us had imagined. In the distance, I could see the lights of the town's houses, flickering faintly in the dusk. Ocean View slept, unaware of the horror lurking in the depths. But not for much longer. I knew I couldn't stay silent, not after what I had seen. I had to warn them, even though I didn't know how to explain what I barely understood myself. When I reached the square, most of the fish stalls were empty, and only a few people remained in the streets. Even so, word of my return to the sea had already spread. John and Paul were there, along with other fishermen, and they watched me with anticipation as I approached. They didn't know what had happened, but I could see the same disbelief in their eyes as before. They thought I was crazy, that my fear was just a moment of panic. "Michael," John said, crossing his arms, "you're back already. Well, did you catch your sea monster?" His tone was laced with sarcasm, and the other fishermen laughed nervously. I ignored them for a moment, lost in my thoughts. I knew they couldn't understand what was at stake, but I had to try to make them see reason. The danger wasn't a fantasy. It wasn't something they could just brush off. The creature was out there, and the disappearances were connected to it somehow. The fear, the real fear, wasn't something they understood yet, but they would soon. "It's not a monster," I finally said, my voice lower than I intended. "It's not just a fish or a fantasy. Whatever's out there, it's something else, something we shouldn't have awakened." The laughter died down quickly as they noticed the seriousness in my tone. John frowned, crossing his arms with a mix of frustration and confusion. "What the hell are you talking about, Michael?" he asked, with no hint of mockery left in his voice. "If it's not a fish or a monster, what is it then?" I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts before answering. I knew I couldn't just tell them I had seen a creature that didn't belong to this world, that I had felt its moan and seen the broken net. How do you explain the inexplicable? There were no words to describe what was happening in those waters, but I tried. "Whatever it is, it's not here to attack us." "Not exactly," I said, still processing what I had experienced. "That thing, whatever it is trying to warn us. It showed me something. A broken net, the same one that belonged to one of the missing fishermen when he left. There's something bigger behind all of this." Silence fell over the group. Some exchanged nervous glances, others seemed skeptical, but no one dared laugh again. The disappearances weighed on everyone's minds, and although many were still searching for rational explanations, the sea's legends and superstitions were beginning to creep into their thoughts. Paul, the oldest among us, was the first to speak after my story. His face was pale, as if my words reminded him of something he had tried to forget. "My grandfather used to tell stories like that," he said quietly, almost in a whisper. "He said there were beings in the sea, creatures that didn't belong to this world, guardians of the deep. I never believed those stories, until now." Everyone remained silent after Paul's words. Even John, who had always been the most skeptical, seemed to doubt his own beliefs. "And what do you suggest we do?" John finally asked, in a much more somber tone. "If there's something out there like you say, how are we supposed to face it? We can't stop fishing. The town depends on the sea." I knew he was right. The town lived off the sea, and although fear was starting to take root in their hearts, they couldn't just abandon their livelihood. But they couldn't ignore what was happening either. Something dark and dangerous was lurking in those waters, and if we didn't act soon, I feared the disappearances would continue. "We can't face it," I said finally, feeling a lump in my throat. "But we can't keep ignoring it either. That creature is trying to tell us something. I don't know what, but we need to understand it before it's too late." The words hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. No one responded immediately, but in their eyes, I saw the same fear that had been haunting me since that morning. They knew something wasn't right, even if they didn't want to admit it. Life in Ocean View, as we knew it, was about to change forever. That night, Ocean View didn't sleep. The town's inhabitants stayed awake much later than usual, whispering to each other, trying to make sense of what I had told them. Rumors spread from house to house, and soon, the story of the sea creature had reached everyone. Some said it was just superstition, that fishermen had always told stories of sea monsters to scare the young, but others, especially the older ones, began to recall ancient legends, stories their grandparents had told them when they were children, tales of beings that lived in the sea long before humans arrived on these shores. My mind couldn't rest. Fear kept me on edge, but so did the need to understand what was happening. I knew there was more behind the disappearances, more behind the creature I had seen. I needed answers. Paul had mentioned that his grandfather spoke of sea guardians, beings that protected something in the depths. I decided to visit him at his house to hear more about those legends. If anyone in Ocean View could help me understand what was going on, it was Paul. His house, an old wooden structure that creaked with the wind, stood on the outskirts of town, near the hills overlooking the ocean. I knocked softly on the door, and soon after, Paul opened it, his face marked with concern. I didn't need to say anything. He knew why I was there. "Come in, Michael," he said, stepping aside to let me in. The inside of his house was modest but cozy. Old nets, rusted fishing tools, and memories of years spent at sea hung on the walls. We sat at the kitchen table, illuminated only by an oil lamp that flickered weakly in the dim light. My grandfather used to talk about things we didn't believe in, Paul began in a low voice. He said the sea is much older than any man, and there are forces in it that we don't understand. Fishermen who disappear, sudden storms. He attributed all of that to the sea guardians. I listened closely, knowing there was more to his words than it seemed. The guardians were ancient creatures, beings that watched over something in the depths, he continued. I don't know what it was, but according to my grandfather, if anything ever disturbed them, they would unleash a curse on those who lived near the sea. My thoughts returned to the creature I had seen, its sad gaze, as if it were trapped in a fate it couldn't control. Could that creature be one of those guardians? Had we disturbed something in the sea without realizing it? What else did your grandfather tell you about those guardians? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I felt fear tightening in my chest. Paul looked me in the eye, and I could see in his gaze that there was something more, something he hadn't wanted to tell me before. He said the guardians didn't just protect the sea, Paul finally whispered. They protected something else, something that, if released, would bring destruction, and if we disturbed them, we'd pay a very high price. Paul's words chilled me. I knew there was more to this story, something we still didn't understand. The creature's moan wasn't just a cry of pain, it was a warning, a sign that something terrible was about to be unleashed on Ocean View. And if we didn't figure out what it was, I feared we would all pay the price. The days that followed my conversation with Paul passed slowly, as if time had stopped to keep us trapped in an atmosphere of fear and tension. Ocean View was gripped by an oppressive silence, and life in the town had changed. No one dared to go out to sea, not even the bravest. The empty nets piled up in the corners, collecting dust, while conversations were reduced to nervous whispers. Stories about the sea guardians became the only topic of conversation at night, when the townspeople gathered in their homes, trying to protect themselves from the unknown danger lurking in the waters. No one knew what to do, but we all knew something terrible was happening, something we couldn't stop. I spent the nights wide awake, staring at the sea from my window, waiting for something. I knew we couldn't just sit back and watch as fear destroyed our community. The creature was trying to tell us something we still didn't understand. We needed to act. Finally, after days of uncertainty, I made a decision. I was going to face the creature once again. I didn't know if I would find answers or death, but I was willing to risk it. I felt it was my responsibility. I had seen the creature, I had heard its moan, and I had witnessed the horrors it had brought with it. I had to find out what it was protecting, and if possible, put an end to all of this. At dawn, I headed to the little one once more. As I pushed it into the water, I felt an unusual calm. The sea was still, but there was something in the air, as if nature itself was waiting for the resolution of it all. The wind wasn't blowing, the waves were gentle, but the weight of destiny seemed to press down on my shoulders. Paul, who had decided to accompany me, approached silently, knowing that this might be our final expedition. We didn't speak. We both knew that words were unnecessary now. We ventured into the sea, heading toward the place where I had seen the creature for the first time, a final journey into the unknown. When we arrived, the sun was barely peeking over the horizon, painting the sky a dark red. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of imminent danger. The waters, which had been so calm for days, began to stir slowly, as if something was awakening from the depths. I knew the creature was near, and then I heard it again, the moan. This time it wasn't a distant whisper. It was a cry that echoed in the air, filled with pain and despair. The creature emerged slowly from the water, its empty eyes fixed on us. It was even more imposing than I remembered, as if each appearance had only revealed a part of its true size. Fear overwhelmed me, but I didn't back away. I stood firm, knowing that the moment had come to confront whatever it was that the creature was trying to tell us. It raised its hand once more, or what seemed to be a hand, and pointed toward the bottom of the sea. "There lies the answer," Paul whispered, as if he understood what the creature wanted. I took a deep breath and decided to follow its signal. We tied a rope with a heavy stone and slowly lowered it into the depths. With every meter the rope descended, I felt we were getting closer to a dark and ancient truth, something the people of Ocean View had ignored for generations. Finally, the rope went taut. There was something down there. We pulled with all our strength, and little by little, an object emerged from the depths, an ancient chest, covered in algae and coral, clearly dragged up from the ocean floor. Paul looked at me with fear in his eyes, knowing that what we were about to discover could change everything. I opened the chest with trembling hands. Inside were the remains of ancient objects, nautical maps, and small gold artifacts. But what caught my attention the most was an old letter, yellowed, written in a script I could barely read. The letter's contents chilled me to the bone. It spoke of an ancient expedition centuries ago, when the first European settlers arrived on these shores. They had captured a creature from the sea, one of the guardians of the depths, believing it to be a trophy that would bring them power and wealth. But instead, they had unleashed a curse, a wrath that would span generations. What I saw wasn't a monster, I said, my voice barely audible. It was a guardian. It's trapped in its own curse. Paul nodded, finally understanding what we had awakened. The sea wasn't our enemy. The creature wasn't a predator, but a victim of the mistakes of men from the past. It was warning us, showing us the consequences of disturbing the natural balance of the waters. We knew what we had to do. Carefully, we returned the chest to the sea, letting it sink once more into the depths, accompanied by our prayers and pleas for forgiveness. We knew the town of Ocean View had lived in ignorance of this curse for far too long. The creature didn't want revenge. It only wanted to free itself from the cycle of pain it was trapped in. The sea began to calm. The creature's moan, which had once filled the air with its despair, slowly faded, leaving behind a peaceful silence. When I looked back at the water, the creature was gone, as if it had finally found the rest it had long sought. Time passed, and Ocean View returned to its rhythm, though the people no longer looked at the sea in the same way. The disappearances stopped, and the fish returned, but the entire town was marked by what had happened. The legends that were once mere tales were now respected and approached with caution. I, Michael, am still a fisherman. The sea calls to me every morning, but I now respect it in a different way. I see it as a place of deep mysteries, a place where forces older than man dwell in silence, guarding their secrets. I never saw the creature again, but on the calmest nights, when the wind blows gently from the ocean, I think I hear a distant echo, a soft whisper that reminds me that the sea, though beautiful, is also a place of awe and fear. Ocean View will never be the same, but we've learned to live with the sea, not as its masters, but as mere inhabitants of its vast domain. And that's how it should be, because the sea never forgets, and neither should we.